There's going to be a substitute teacher today. I expect you to be productive and do everything that you're asked to do. And I also expect you to have good manners and be helpful and supportive. Today in class, I'm going to give you this video and I'm going to discuss chapters 9 and 10, and I'm going to give you two assignments. One assignment is to read chapters 11 and 12 before Wednesday, but I'm also going to give you a set of questions that needs to be answered before Wednesday. Now, I need you to remember something. After Wednesday, everybody's going to go away for a week without walls. So if you don't turn in these assignments on Wednesday, there's really not going to be a time when you can turn them in. So the assignments that you get today need to be done before Wednesday, and they need to be turned in on Wednesday at the very beginning of class. If you have any questions, you can WhatsApp me or write me an email. Okay, let's talk about To Kill a Mockingbird, and let's talk about chapter 9. The book is starting to get good. One of the things that's happening in this book is that Harper Lee is trying to give you a realistic depiction of racism in the South in the 1930s. When Scout is at school, she gets in a fight with a kid named Cecil Jacobs, who keeps referring to her father as a nigger lover. Scout doesn't actually really know what that means. I'd be willing to bet that Cecil Jacobs probably doesn't know what that means either. They're both in second grade, but he's heard this from his own family or from other people in that community, and that's what people say about Atticus Finch. The truth is, Atticus Finch is an attorney, and he has a client that he's doing what's called pro bono work for. Pro bono work is work that lawyers do for free. Every lawyer is expected to take cases for free every once in a while, and this would be his. He's been assigned this by the state, and he's going to defend this black man who's been accused of rape. Cecil Jacobs uses this phrase to goat Scout, but remember, Scout has promised her father that she won't fight anybody just because they're insulting him. This is difficult for her. When she gets home, she tells her father what happens, and she uses the N-word herself. It's what everybody at her school uses. It's the way common people talk. And actually, that's what her father tells her. His father, Atticus Finch, tells Scout, don't use that word. It's common. See, he knows how vulgar that word is. And it's not like the word has changed definitions in the last 40 or 50 years. That word means the same now as it did in the 1930s. It is a really offensive word. But it was also really common in the South in the 1930s. Scout acts like she doesn't understand. She thinks, probably rightly so, if she stops saying it, she'll be the only person that stops saying it. And that probably is pretty close to the truth. But she agrees to follow her father's advice anyway, and she's going to try not to use that word anymore. Atticus tells Scout a little bit about Tom Robinson. He says that Tom Robinson goes to the same church as Calpurnia, and that his family is decent and hardworking. They're still poor, and they still live in the black section of town. They are, of course, going to be segregated no matter what their character is like in the 1930s. He also said that he got a postponement, which means the trial won't start for a couple months yet. But Atticus Finch knows that this is a very political thing that is about to happen. And he also knows that he's not just trying to protect a man from being wrongly convicted. He's also going up against the racism of the entire South. These immoral and unjust social institutions, that's what he's really going to battle against. And I need you to always remember what Atticus is trying to do is save an innocent man's life from an unjust, brutal, and violent murder. Scout asks her father why he's going to defend Tom Robinson, and I think it's really important to look exactly at what he says. He says this, for a number of reasons. The main one is, if I didn't, I couldn't hold my head up in town. I couldn't represent this county in the legislature. I couldn't even tell you or Jim not to do something again. Scout says, you mean if you didn't defend that man, Jim and me wouldn't have to mind you anymore? Atticus replies, that's about right. Why? asks Scout. Because I could never ask you to mind me again, Scout. Simply by the nature of the work, every lawyer gets at least one case in his lifetime that affects him personally. This one's mine, I guess. You might hear some ugly talk about it at school, but do one thing for me, if you will. Just hold your head high and keep those fists down. No matter what anybody says to you, don't let them get your goat. Try fighting with your head for a change. It's a good one, even if it does resist learning. It's kind of a funny little end there. But it's a good moral lesson for his daughter. He's telling her, don't fight with your fist. Don't immediately go to violence. It's an important lesson for Scout. The other thing that it's really important that you know is what Atticus knows before the whole trial starts. Atticus knows for a fact he's going to lose. There's no way he can win. Even though Tom Robinson really is innocent, and the facts will really be in Tom Robinson's favor, Atticus Finch is going to lose this case. He's a really good attorney, and if everything were judged fairly, of course Tom Robinson would be found innocent. But Atticus knows ahead of time that that's not going to happen, and he teaches that to Scout. This is what he says to Scout. She says, Atticus, are we going to win it? No, honey. Then why? And Atticus says, simply because we were licked 100 years before we started is no reason for us not to try to win, Atticus said. He knows that the institutions of slavery and the institutions that followed slavery, which were horrific in their own right, that period of Reconstruction and the rise of what is essentially terrorism, all of those things together are really working against Atticus Finch. And therefore, he doesn't have a chance of winning, but he has to do his utmost to try to save this man. That's his moral duty to himself and to his community and to his family, and least of which also to Tom Robinson. This image comes from the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's in Montgomery, Alabama. It's only been there a few years, but it's, I think, one of the most important things that has happened in the United States in recent years. One of the things that this represents is this artwork, especially that you're seeing, but the purpose of the whole museum is to make what you see here are 805 hanging steel rectangles. Each one of those rectangles up there is about the size of a coffin. What it's supposed to represent are the more than 4,075 documented lynchings of African Americans that took place between 1877 and 1950, and almost all of them were concentrated in the 12 southernmost states. This is the legacy of the South. It is one of brutality. I don't think it's unfair to call it terrorism. I think it is horrific, and I think it is shameful. But this is the legacy that Atticus Finch is fighting against. The novel changes settings in chapter 9. The kids get off school and they go for Christmas to Finch's Landing. Now, this is a short drive from their house. They're meeting their Uncle Jack there, the one who's a doctor, and they're going to, and the person who lives at Finch's Landing is their Aunt Alexandria. Now, Alexandria is Atticus's sister, and Uncle Jack is his brother, but these people are very different. There's another uncle, I think his name's Uncle Jimmy, but he's not important. He doesn't even talk to the kids. The other person who's there is Aunt Alexandria's son, Francis. He's horrible. He's a terrible human being. He seems to be a year or so older than Scout, but he's really stupid, and he's really spoiled by his mother, and he's also really racist. But I also get the feeling that many of the racist things that he says, he's heard from Aunt Alexandria. And that's kind of sad. I think Harper Lee, in part of this book, has something valuable to say about how children should be treated. When Scout is describing her Uncle Jack, this is what she says about him. She says, "He was one of the few men of science who never terrified me. Probably because he never behaved like a doctor. Whenever he performed a minor service for Jim and me, as removing a splinter from a foot, he would tell us exactly what he's going to do, give us an estimation of how much it would hurt, and explain the use of any tongs or any tools he employed. This idea that you should be completely blunt and honest with children, I think that's a good idea, and I think it's also something that Harper Lee believes as well. I think it's intelligent. Later, Uncle Jack will, Scout's going to hear the vulgar phrase, whore lady. Francis is going to accuse Scout of calling him a whore lady. That means a prostitute. Scout and Francis both don't know what that means. But Scout asks Uncle Jack what that means. What is a whore lady? And Uncle Jack doesn't tell her. But he does tell the story to Atticus, and Atticus says, "Oh, you should have told her. You should always just tell them the truth. Don't make a big deal out of it." I think it's a good idea as well. Even with small children, you should always be honest. One thing that I think is really funny in this chapter is that Scout has started practicing with using vulgar or bad language. She thinks it'll get her out of school, as if, she learned how to say these bad words at school. So maybe if she uses them in casual conversation, Atticus won't make her go to school anymore. So she says vulgar but also kind of funny things like, "Pass the damn potatoes." Uncle Jack kind of scolds her about it, but I can tell what Atticus is doing. He's trying not to give her too much attention, because if you give a child too much attention for doing something like that, they just do it more. The other thing I wanted to tell you about was their Christmas presents. They call both Jim and Scout, and remember, Jim's about, I guess he'd be about 13, and Scout would be 7 or 8. They both get air rifles. Where I come from, air rifles are also called BB guns, but these are the rifle kinds, and they're more powerful than the pistol kinds. An air rifle isn't a toy. It's not usually a lethal weapon. In fact, it's not. But it could easily put somebody's eye out. They really hurt badly. You could easily kill a bird with them, or put a little, like I used to shoot holes in Diet Coke cans. Actually, they weren't Diet Coke cans, but I used to break glass bottles with them. But it's also, it's kind of embarrassing actually, but that was a pretty normal toy for me when I was 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And for all the other kids in my neighborhood, it seemed kind of normal that we would go out and shoot squirrels and birds with these toys. Now I think that that's kind of horrible, and I really regret that I had that. One conflict between Aunt Alexandria and Scout is the fact that Scout isn't very feminine. She's described as a tomboy, She usually wears breeches, which just means pants or overalls. So she dresses like a boy pretty much on every page of this book. Um, Aunt Alexandria wants her to be feminine and wear dresses and play with little girl clothes, but that's not who Scout is. She likes to fight. She likes to play with boys. She likes to do things that her older brother does. And those are sort of the major influences in her life. There's also a kind of running gag that goes through this book. It has to do with Dill and how she and Dill have promised to marry each other later in life. And I don't know, it seems like a kind of an innocent thing that kids do and talk about, but I don't know. It opens her up though. Francis insults Dill. He says that he's homeless and that he just gets passed around to different relatives. And that makes Scout really dislike Francis. But what really, really gets her goat is when Francis starts insulting Atticus. He starts calling him a nigger lover. Again, that is such a horrific and racist thing to say, and I'm not sure that even Francis understands the implications of what the horrible thing he's saying means. Eventually, Scout gets so mad at Francis that she punches him in the mouth so hard that she bloodies up her knuckles on his front teeth. Uncle Jack later on will sort of fix it for her. When they get caught, one of the things that happens is Francis lies and said that Scout called him a whore lady, which is kind of ridiculous, but that's sort of the end of Christmas dinner. I did want you to know that what ends up being discussed after this is Uncle Jack, they all go back to Atticus's house, and Uncle Jack and Atticus talk about the upcoming case with Tom Robinson. One of the things that they know is that this case is going to be a big deal, that it's going to be a really traumatic experience for Jim and for Scout, that this is going to be a hard time for everybody. And they're actually sort of like, but also you get this sense that Atticus realizes that he has this great challenge before him, and like a real man and like a real hero, Atticus is up for it. When the chapter ends, we realize that Scout has been overhearing Uncle Jack and Atticus. Uncle Jack doesn't betray Scout. He doesn't say why she was fighting with Francis. He keeps that secret for her. That sort of helps the bond between those two. The other thing that we learn is how wise Atticus is. He has this rather adult conversation with Uncle Jack, but towards the end of it, he tells Scout, who's just been hiding and eavesdropping, to go to bed. Scout says later on in life, years later, that he probably wanted her to hear that whole conversation, so she knew what her future was going to be like. I get that sense especially because he'd also just finished telling Uncle Jack that you got to be honest with kids. You got to tell them the truth. You got to tell them when things are going to happen. Before I start talking about Chapter 10, I want to give you a literary term that I need you to remember. It's probably a good term to write on somewhere in your book, and I especially need you to remember it because I need you to be able to apply it to Chapter 10. The literary term is characterization. Characterization is a thing that authors do. They create characters and they give details about those characters that help us to know who they are, what they're like, how they think, how they dress, how they act. It's how we can imagine these characters in our minds because the authors have already provided those things for us. It also allows us to anticipate what the character is going to do next because that we feel like we know them, so we feel like we understand what their next actions are going to be. This is especially true in chapter 10, and I want you to think about this carefully. One of the first things we learn about Atticus in chapter 10 is that he's an old dad. Atticus is an older dad than Jim and Scout's friends and at school have. They say that he's almost 50, and they say it as if that's really ancient. That would be about 5 years younger than me. Anyway, not only that, but they also describe him as kind of feeble, and he wears glasses. Anyway, he's not really much of an athlete. We don't know what he was like as a younger man, but we do know that, Jim is, 13, 14 years old. He likes playing football. He likes doing sports. And Atticus is really at an age where he's too old to do that. When their church has a touch football game with another church, the Baptist church, the men, the younger dads, the guys in their 20s and 30s and 40s, they're out there playing, but Atticus is too old to play. And at the beginning of the chapter, Jim's a little bit embarrassed by that. Another thing happens when we have these the other thing that's happening is Jim and Scout are going out with their BB guns, or air rifles as they call them in this, and they're starting to do things with them. Now they're doing the normal things where they, shoot cans and do things like that. But Atticus knows that if you give a boy like Jim a BB gun like this, eventually he's going to go after birds and squirrels. Atticus says, you can go after all the blue jays that you want, but it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. Now this quote is the most important quote in the book. It's where Harper Lee gets her title, and it's really important that you understand what this means. But I would also mark it in chapter 10 because you're going to want to find this quote again. He says it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. It says that Scout asked Miss Maudie what this means, and Miss Maudie agrees with Atticus that it is a sin to kill a mockingbird. Now, blue jays, they're horrible. They screech, they tear things up, they poop everywhere. They're awful things. But mockingbirds, all mockingbirds do is they sing beautifully all day long, and they do it in these lovely, lovely ways and in many different voices because they mimic or mock the music of other birds as well. Why would you want to kill something that only brings pleasure to other people? It's a sin to kill a mockingbird. Now that idea, you're going to need to carry that with you for the rest of the book and apply it to other things. So Jim and Scout start looking for something that would redeem their father in their eyes, especially Jim. Atticus doesn't do anything with his hands. He doesn't build anything or drive anything. He's not the sheriff. He's not the carpenter. He works in an office all day, and he actually does help people all day. But from the perspective of a boy like Jim or a little girl like Scout, they don't see something in their father that makes him sort of heroic or somebody to look up to. That changes when the dog shows up on the street. Now, the dog has a funny name, which I'm missing right now. Yes, the dog's name is Tim Johnson. It sounds more like a person's name. In fact, it's interesting that the dog has a last name. The dog, everybody can recognize what's happening when they see the dog, and it might not be something that you would recognize right away. But this dog has rabies. In fact, I don't even think the chapter mentions that word, rabies, but the dog has the disease rabies. Rabies is transmitted through saliva. If something that has rabies bites you, you're going to get very sick. In modern times, today, if something like this bit you, well, we could save your life. The treatments are actually kind of horrible, but you might not die if you got proper medical attention right away. But in the 1930s, there is no treatment for rabies, and it is a violent, horrific death. You basically die of dehydration. You can't drink water. You can't get fluids in yourself. And your brain really does sort of rot and go mad. It is a really, really awful way to die. This dog is suffering from rabies. And the reason they always call them a mad dog is because the dogs are in so much pain and they're so frightened and they don't know what's happening to them. So when you get near them, they could be all defensive and they really are quite likely to bite, even though that's actually a death sentence for anybody that they do bite, including people who are trying to help them. So everybody on the street does the best they can. They call each other, they all go inside, they all sort of protect themselves as best they can, while this clearly sick dog is walking down the street. Calpurnia starts calling people. One of the first person she calls is Atticus Finch, and then she calls the operator. We don't really have phone operators like this, and the phone operator for the town calls everybody else on the street. Calpurnia also goes over to the Radley house, and there was some tiny detail there that I really wanted you to notice. She gathers up her skirts and runs to their house and bangs on their front door trying to warn them. And Jim says something interesting. He says, she's supposed to go around back. See, Jim knows that black people in this place and in this time aren't allowed to go to people's front doors. They're always expected to go around and go into houses through the back door. That used to be the kitchen door for most houses, and that was the only way blacks were allowed to walk into white houses. It's a really tiny detail and most people miss it, but it reminds us of how shameful this time was. Now Calpurnia is doing the best thing she possibly can, trying to help her neighbors, and she certainly doesn't want to be in the street very long, so she's just going the quickest way she can and doing the smartest thing she can do. But it is a subtle reminder that there's something kind of off about this time and this place. Actually, it was not Jim. I'm just looking at the passage. It was Scout who says that, but the point is still the same. One of the things that we find out is that the dog isn't running. That's a good news. It's sort of very sick, and one of the things that happens is Atticus shows up and he's got the sheriff with him. Now, the thing that happens next is actually pretty interesting. There seems to be an argument between Atticus and the sheriff about who should shoot the dog. I mean, it seems obvious to me that the sheriff should shoot the dog. It's the sheriff's gun, and it's the sheriff's job. But the dog is far enough away that the sheriff doesn't feel comfortable doing it. So he asks Atticus to do it. In fact, he pretty much forces Atticus to do it. The sheriff says this, "For God's sakes, Mr. Finch, look where he is. Miss, and you'll go straight into the Radley house. I can't shoot that well, and you know it." Atticus responds, "I haven't shot a gun in 30 years. Mr. Tate, that's the sheriff, says, Mr. Tate almost threw the rifle at Atticus. "I'd feel mighty comfortable if you did it now," he said. In a fog, Jim and I watched our father take the gun and walk out into the middle of the street. He walked quickly, but I thought he moved like an underwater swimmer. Time had slowed to a nauseating crawl. When Atticus raised his glasses, Calpurnia murmured, "Sweet Jesus, help him," and put her hands to her cheeks. Atticus pushed his glasses to his forehead, but they slipped down and he dropped them in the street. In the silence, I heard them crack. Atticus rubbed his eyes and chin. We saw him blink hard. In front of the Radley gate, Tim Johnson, the dog, had made up what was left of his mind. He'd finally turned himself around to pursue his original course up our street. He made 2 steps forward and then stopped and raised his head. We saw his body go rigid. With movements so swift they seemed simultaneous, Atticus's hand yanked a ball-tipped lever as he brought the gun to his shoulder. The rifle cracked. Tim Johnson leaped, flopped over, and crumpled on the sidewalk in a brown and white heap. He didn't know what hit him. Mr. Tate jumped off the porch and ran to the Radley place. He stopped in front of the dog, squatted, turned around, and tapped his finger on his forehead above his left eye. "You were a little to the right, Mr. Finch," he called. "Always was," answered Atticus. "If I'd had my druthers, I'd take a shotgun." You have to get the joke here. He's only missed by an inch or two the center of the dog's head. It was a spectacular shot. Now, a shotgun doesn't shoot bullets. A shotgun sprays pellets. It's easy to hit something with a shotgun. But what Atticus has done here is really kind of an amazing feat. Obviously, everyone is impressed. But the thing that you're really supposed to notice, the thing that I need to make sure everybody gets, isn't what he does, although it is impressive, and Jim is certainly impressed. But what's also really important is that you see what a humble man Atticus Finch is. He doesn't really want anybody to notice. He doesn't want to be famous for this thing. And we also got really strong hints that he doesn't like guns. Those are all important things. Now, the substitute's going to give you an assignment, but it's also going to be up on Haiku. And I'm going to ask you or tell you again that you have 2 responsibilities. Before I see you on Wednesday, everybody needs to read chapters 11 and 12. And also, these questions that you're going to get today, they need to be done, and they need to be put on the they're going to need to be turned in on Wednesday. No exceptions. Absolutely none. Okay. I'm sorry. I really do miss you guys. I will see you on Wednesday.